Hello and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to episode 12 of NCERT International Relations. Today and tomorrow, we will focus our discussion on international organizations and their role in the world order. So, today we'll focus specifically on the United Nations and the relevance of international organizations in contemporary world. Tomorrow, we will talk about a number of UN related agencies, programs, specialized agencies, and other international organizations. This will help you better understand multilateral frameworks and why these platforms are critical in today's diplomacy. So, this discussion is part of the ongoing series on NCERT international relations, where we are covering 16 important topics from class 12 textbooks on contemporary world politics and politics in India since independence. So, first, let's address one very important question. Why do these international organizations exist? What is the role of the United Nations? What is their primary purpose? See, the main goal of any international multilateral organization is to maintain peace and stability, to prevent wars and conflicts, to bring nations together, to achieve some cooperation between them, especially where global efforts are required to deal with a global level challenge. Let's say a pandemic has been spreading, or to deal with developmental issues like poverty, or to address the issues posed by climate change. This is where one country alone cannot act. It requires a global collaborative effort, or to resolve standing disputes, or to deal with a humanitarian situation, or massive disasters which might be occurring across the world. So one or few countries they cannot deal with these issues on their own and requires the global community to come together. So the main purpose of United Nations and other related international organizations is to prevent any such wars and conflicts, to handle the disputes that exist between two nations or two or more countries, settle them peacefully, bring them to the negotiating table, ensure that a bigger war is prevented, and maintain international peace and security. Also, deal with other threats and challenges, including terrorism, organized crime, piracy, any such threat which could destabilize the world. It requires a global coordinated effort. So, these platforms will help bring these nations together and achieve international cooperation between them. It will also help give a push for global developmental approach to focus on human development, to address issues related to food security, hunger, nutrition, to focus on disaster management and disaster risk reduction, or to ensure that any other challenge from a pandemic to climate change is effectively handled and tackled with minimal damage on humanity. That is the primary purpose behind any such multilateral platform. But however, when you look at the real world scenario, whether these organizations are effective, has the UN been living up to its expectations? There is a lot of criticism that these organizations often face. Look at the cartoons that are placed on the screen. Most of them they take a critical view of the UN and other related organizations which have largely failed in achieving these objectives. Many consider the United Nations to be a useless, ineffective organization. Look at all the conflicts that have taken place, from US military invasions in Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, or ongoing civil wars and conflicts from Africa to Myanmar, or Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism. In any of these big developments, the UN's role was minimal or it was largely missing. And if at all the UN got involved in such global conflicts, wars, and disputes, its role became controversial as it was accused of acting in a biased manner to favor one set of countries against the other. For example, how over the Kashmir issue, United Nations was largely used by UK to favor Pakistan against India. That is something we have already covered in detail in our previous sessions. If you look at the UN Security Council, how it has been turned into an elite club of a few nations which have essentially used the UN for their own narrow geopolitical agendas, it raises big questions on whether these organizations are they even required, are they even relevant. See, in today's world, we are facing an incredible threat to rules-based order, where established rules are being blatantly broken by the biggest powers, then the institutional structure that exists is being disrespected by the most important powers. For example, look at Israel's military aggression across the region, or the large scale atrocities that Israel allegedly has committed in Palestinian territories, particularly in Gaza, in the ongoing Gaza conflict, with more than 70,000 Palestinians killed, or the lack of action against Pakistan for continuously sponsoring terrorism, using it as a proxy against India and the world. Or look at the American military action along with Israel against Iran, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or China's aggression in South China Sea. In all these circumstances, the UN was largely missing. So, today you find a serious threat to rules based order and the global institutional architecture which has been built. The biggest powers have not only been challenging the existing world order, they are disrupting it, they are dismantling it. So, where does this leave a country like India? Because India's foreign policy is built on complete faith and allegiance with the international rules based system. So, that is where this uncomfortable question is raised. Are these organizations even required? Are they even relevant? If they are missing in action, if they are failing to achieve their objectives, if big powers are getting away with all the violations, and if they are dismantling the rules based order and selectively imposing these rules only on select targeted countries, then what is the very purpose of these organizations? To answer this, we need to look at the exact role which is envisioned for these international organizations. It is often said that an organization like the UN or any other international organization, it was never designed to take humanity towards a utopian world. It was never meant to take humanity towards heaven, towards complete peace, security, stability, growth, and development. It was actually meant to prevent the worst outcomes in geopolitics, to ensure humanity is not dragged towards hell, because nation states have a proclivity, they have an inclination towards turning disputes into bigger wars, turning minor issues into bigger escalations and confrontations, which could result in more chaos. It could result in more destruction, devastation. And we have seen this happen during the World War period. So, according to UN's second Secretary General, he had often said that United Nations was never created to take humanity to heaven, but to save humanity from reaching hell, as in to avoid the worst possible outcomes in global diplomacy, to prevent wars, to prevent the worst outcomes for humanity. That is the role, that is the purpose of the UN. Because without these institutions, without these platforms, you are staring at an outright escalation for every dispute. What will happen if every country turns a small dispute into a bigger war or a conflict? Can you even imagine the humanitarian consequences of that? As I said, during World War One, World War Two, the lack of such institutions or the failure of such institutions in many ways contributed to these big conflicts, triggering a human catastrophe. And that is the last thing that humanity wants today. So these platforms may not be perfect. They were never designed to be perfect. They were never designed to achieve all their objectives. Yes, they are flawed institutions, but without them, you have no rules based order. Without them, it is complete anarchy, complete chaos. And that is the reason why India continues to have faith in a multilateral world order. India continues to believe in international organizations and a rules based order. Because without these institutions, you are basically moving towards a world without any set of rules. Yes, these rules may not be perfect, they may not be effective, they might be violated, but you at least have a platform where you can call out the actions of the violators, hold them accountable, bring some pressure on them, and that prevents humanity from encountering the worst of consequences which could arise out of geopolitics. Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who has served the UN, made a very important remark. He was asked by a journalist that UN is just a talking shop, that diplomats, leaders get together just to talk and bore each other. So, to this question, Shashi Tharoor replied that yes, UN is a talking shop. Let it be a talking shop. He quoted Winston Churchill, who said, it is much better to bore each other through their words coming out of their mouth, engage in a jaw to jaw fight, instead of a war which could actually bore holes into a country and its infrastructure and society. Instead of actual conflicts in the battlefield where countries might destroy and decimate each other, it's better for leaders and diplomats to bore each other in a talking shop. Let them talk, let them discuss, use rhetoric, blame each other, accuse each other, but at least they will be able to come to some common ground, maintain some sense of peace and stability, and prevent humanity from being dragged towards hell, towards the worst possible outcome. So, this tells you everything about the UN and the international framework in general. These institutions, they were never supposed to be perfect. They can't be perfect because the world itself doesn't exist in black and white, right? It doesn't exist in binary. It exists somewhere in between. And these institutions at least provide a sense of balance in a chaotic world. It helps prevent the worst possible outcomes. And that is something we have seen time and again with UN and other international organizations. I think that probably explains why these organizations are even relevant. Is the UN the most effective organization? Absolutely no. UN is a highly flawed organization. It has several structural issues. It has functional problems. It has been highly ineffective. Correct. But at the same time, without the UN, can you imagine a world order? Can you imagine what would happen without the UN Charter, without a set of international law, without a set of international customary rules and laws that are expected to be followed and upheld by every nation? Without that, you are basically moving towards a complete anarchy, a complete chaos in the world order. And that is where these institutions, they play a role. They definitely have an impact in creating diplomatic pressure, in acting as a system of checks and balances, and ensuring some form of accountability. They may not deliver justice, they may not actually punish the violators, but they may hold back those aggressive powers. They can help prevent the worst of atrocities from being committed. So you might have a counter argument. You might say, despite the UN being present, large scale genocides have been committed. The genocide in Rwanda, for example, right? Or Israel is accused of committing a genocide in Gaza. You might ask, what did the UN do? I agree that UN may not be able to prevent these outcomes. It has been ineffective in this regard. But at the same time, without UN, the world would be even worse. If today, if you think the world is in a worst situation, without UN and multilateral organizations, things will get even more worse, even more dirty. And that is what UN prevents. That is what international organizations keep in check. And that explains why these institutions are critical. So, if let's say there is a mains question, UPSC might ask this question. Now that international rules are being blatantly violated, dismantled, organizations are being disrespected, rules based order is being blatantly violated, why do you think these organizations are relevant in today's world? Illustrate. This can be a mains question. So, your argument would be that international organizations, they may not be the perfect answer for every problem and solution, right? They play a critical role, as I said, in managing disputes, avoiding wars, avoiding the worst case outcomes. They play a role in holding and reining back countries. They help in isolating few countries, acting against few nations which are acting as rogue countries. They bring some sense of accountability. They create a platform where countries can criticize the others, bring that into question, bring that into limelight. In a way, that's exactly what a parliament does. A parliament is also a talking shop, but it's a critical institution where the opposition can hold the ruling party accountable. It may not be the most effective platform, but it does play a role in a democracy acting as a system of checks and balances. And similarly, the UN and all the international organizations, they play a similar role in global politics. They contribute towards a better living standard. It may not be the best living standard, but slightly it will improve the living conditions. Through institutions like UN, its funds, programs, and specialized agencies, today we are focusing on human development through Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals. There is at least some focus on education, healthcare, literacy levels, standard of living, elevating poverty, tackling hunger and malnutrition, improving sanitation and hygiene, focusing on maternal health, infant health. Without the UN and the framework it has created, most countries, governments would never be prioritizing these administrative issues. So, post Second World War, the world moved towards a welfare model. During the World War era, most countries were obsessed with the police state model, where they had securitized every aspect of governance, focusing on military, on arms acquisition, on intelligence and spying and covert operations. That was the obsession of almost every state during the war period. But the harsh lessons of World War I and World War II, it pushed the world towards a governance oriented approach, a welfare model, at least in democratic states. It finally led governments to focus on issues that mattered to the citizens. And the UN contributed the framework for a developmental agenda, tackling pollution, for example, dealing with disasters, providing humanitarian aid and assistance. All of this came into mainstream governance because of the efforts of UN and other related international organizations, without which such global efforts probably would have never been seen. And that is where the relevance of these institutions lie. They may not be effective, they may not be perfect, but without them, the world would be much worse off. We are in a much better off position because of the presence of these institutions. So, on several global issues, you require countries to come together, to cooperate with each other. That is where these institutions make their relevance known to the rest of the world. According to the NCERT itself, these institutions may not be completely effective as envisioned. But when it comes to important global challenges where one country or few countries alone cannot act, that is where these institutions play a role in achieving international cooperation. Now, take the COVID 19 pandemic, for example, right? You might criticize the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is a part of the UN system, for failing to hold China accountable for the initial mistakes which contributed to the global spread of COVID 19. You might even criticize the WHO and the UN for playing a very limited role during the pandemic itself. But imagine without WHO, without the UN, what would have been the scenario? Be it for coordinating with countries to impose travel restrictions, lockdowns, and quarantine standards, or for rolling out vaccines and achieving herd level immunity across the world, or focusing on the genetic breakup of the virus itself, tracking the mutations, and providing early warning alerts, disseminating that information. Without that role of WHO and UN institutions, probably the pandemic would have been much worse. Yes, WHO could not hold China completely accountable. WHO has its structural problems, right? It can't enforce its policies. It lacks that enforcement authority. It's almost like a toothless organization. But without WHO, things would be even more worse. You take an issue like climate change, for example, tackling greenhouse gas emissions, focusing on climate action. Today, the world is talking about it, prioritizing solar, wind, and clean renewable energy, moving away from fossil fuels, at least to some extent. And it's all because of the UN, which created a platform, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has led to a global discussion on the topic of global warming and climate change. The outcomes like Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, they may not be perfect. They may not help humanity to avoid the worst effects of climate change. But at least it creates a framework where countries can hold each other accountable. Can you imagine developed countries ever owning up to their historical responsibilities and their historical emissions? That was possible just because of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where countries like India, other developing, underdeveloped nations got together and presented a united front to act against developed nations and bring out their historical responsibilities, to bring out the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So, small nations will never have a voice in global politics without these institutions. Forget a country like India, even let's say small nations like Maldives or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh. Do you think they would ever be able to raise their voice? What do you think of African nations or small island countries in the Oceania, in the Pacific region? Can they ever bring up their issues, which is affecting them, bothering them because of the policies of other nations? Do you think the big developed countries would hear them, give them a ear? It would never happen without institutions like the UN and the global framework that they create. Now, can you find out other such global issues where international cooperation is mandatory, where it is required? Apart from epidemics and pandemics, apart from climate change, are there any other global issues where global coordination is necessary, where an institution like UN and its other organs can play a role? Can you mention such issues in the comment section below? Take it as a homework, take it as a small exercise. Can you tell me other pressing global challenges where coordination and cooperation is necessary, where an institution like UN can actually play a positive role? So please let me know in the comments. Now, before we proceed to talk about the UN, its history, evolution, and its entire structure, let me bring out one important announcement for UPSC aspirants. Those of you who are preparing for the upcoming attempts, if you're looking for a well structured, guided program, then Unacademy is presenting that opportunity for you to enroll into our online classes at the lowest price ever. The subscription is now available at just 16,999 with up to 12 months of free extension. And I'm told the offer ends tonight. Along with getting one of the lowest price ever, along with a free extension, you also stand a chance to get up to 29,000 rupees worth subscriptions, including access to state PCS courses, then courses related to CDS NDA, and as well as prelims and mains crash course. It will come bundled as one offer. And those of you who are interested to avail this special offer, head to the description box, click on the link, and enter the code IAS English in order to avail this special offer. So, now coming back to our discussion, as part of this NCERT series on international relations, we are also conducting a free special quiz on the Unacademy app. Every Thursday and Friday at 3 p.m., we have been conducting these sessions. And just today afternoon, we held the fifth special class where we have been providing practice questions of UPSC standard to help students practice and revise these topics and attempt UPSC standard prelims questions. So if you want to attend the last session, which is tomorrow at 3 p.m., just scan the QR code on your screen and the session link would be provided over there. Even the previous sessions are available in recorded format and you can access them via this QR code by scanning it. At the end of this course on 31st August, we'll be conducting a mega quiz, again on the Unacademy app, where you will get a chance to attempt 50 MCQs from international relations based on the topics that we are covering in this particular course. The test will take place from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. and you will not only get to revise and practice, the top performers will also get a 20% discount on Unacademy Platinum subscription. So to enroll for the mega quiz, please scan this QR code and without fail take up the quiz on 31st August. And if you want the PDF of this session, just scan the QR code here. By tomorrow, we'll be sharing the PDFs, which includes the annotations as well. Now, coming back to our discussion, let's focus on the UN itself. Let's understand its structure, history, evolution, and what India has with regard to its engagement with the UN. When you look at the United Nations, today it is the foremost leading global organization that almost has universal membership. It has 193 member states. The establishment of this organization goes back to 1945, the end of the Second World War, which led to the formation of the United Nations Organization, or the UNO, which is built on the principles of the UN Charter. The UN Charter is like the constitution of the UN, which identifies the objectives of the UN, lays out the structure of the UN, the functioning and the internal mechanisms of the UN. So all these are contained under the UN Charter. It essentially places few restrictions on the member states. Take, for example, Article 2 of the UN Charter, which prohibits countries from using force or even issuing threats that could destabilize the political stability of a nation, which means countries are prohibited from invading another country, attacking another country. There is a prohibition under the UN Charter from disrespecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another nation. The use of force is explicitly prohibited, and the only exception provided is in self defense. Article 51 provides for countries to act in self-defense, to defend against an external attack. If there is an external armed attack against them, they can definitely act in self-defense. But of course, as you know, many countries often violate these provisions, be it Russia's invasion of Ukraine or Israel's action across West Asia from Gaza to Iran to Lebanon, or US invasion of Afghanistan, Iraq, and now the attacks against Iran. All those developments essentially violate these core principles of the UN Charter. But the existence of these principles play a very important role to expose these powers which are violating international law, to call out their hypocrisy, to call out the atrocities that they're responsible for. You may not get the perfect solution at the end of it, you may not get justice, but it does create a mechanism where some sense of accountability can be provided. At least some counter pressure can be created against big powers and keep them under check, right? If, let's say, China is openly violating UN clause provisions in the South China Sea, threatening the territorial integrity of other nations, the only mechanism through which China can be reined in to some extent is through the principles of the UN and the foundation that it creates as part of the international legal framework. So, without that, as I said, the world would be in a much worse off position. So, when you look at the history of this organization, before the UN, we had a global organization known as the League of Nations, created after World War I through the Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, which brought World War I to an end. The League of Nations was supposed to be an international organization that could prevent a future war, another global conflict. But most historians and experts agree that League of Nations was not just a massive failure. It not only failed at all its objectives, in many ways it contributed to the Second World War. Now, this is where you can anticipate prelims or even mains questions from world history and international relations. UPSC might ask you, why was the League of Nations a failure? How did it contribute to Second World War? See, first of all, in the League of Nations, the major powers were not part of it. United States and Soviet Union, they both stayed out of the League of Nations. Then the rising fascist powers like Germany, Italy, Japan, they all quit the League of Nations when their aggression was questioned, when they were annexing territories and spreading their radical fascist ideology, when questions were raised against the policies of, let's say, Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy and imperial fascist Japan, they simply withdrew from the League of Nations and exited. On the other hand, the colonial powers like Britain and France, they were using this platform for their own self-serving agenda. They were essentially using League of Nations to further humiliate the countries which had lost World War One. Right? The victors of World War One, Britain and France, they used this platform to essentially humiliate countries like Germany, to extract war reparations, to impose very strict conditions that led to the impact on German national pride, which affected German economy. Right? The common people in Germany were severely affected by the consequences. And that is exactly what leaders like Hitler and the Nazi party used to build the radical extremist ideology and led to the emergence of a fascist Germany. In many ways, Britain and France and the selfish agendas they had contributed to the Second World War and the eventual demise of the League of Nations and the failure of League of Nations. Britain and France basically divided up the colonies that were held by those who lost the World War One and created British and French mandate. For example, look at Ottoman Turks who lost to the alliance of Britain and France. Britain and France divided up today's West Asia region amongst themselves, from today's Palestine and Israel to Syria and Jordan, bringing all these territories under their own control, which was essentially a new type of colonialism. They took the colonies of the others, the losers of World War One, and made it their own mandate territories, imposing their will in order to serve their narrow geopolitical interests. So the misuse of League of Nations, the absence of US and Soviet Union, and the exit of Germany, Italy, and Japan were the primary reasons behind the failure of League of Nations and the eventual demise of this organization. It not only failed as an international organization, in many ways it contributed to the fresh rivalries that emerged. It contributed to the rise of Nazi Germany and fascist sentiments across Italy, Japan, etc., and paved the path for Second World War. So that's why during the Second World War, global leaders like F.D. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, they felt the need to replace the League of Nations and bring out a new institution. So in 1941, US and Britain had signed the Atlantic Charter to create a framework for a post World War era to prepare the world once the Second World War would come to an end. By then, Second World War was already underway. So F.D. Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, and signed the Atlantic Charter to think of a global framework where countries can work together, resolve their disputes, avoid such big conflicts. This led to the declaration by United Nations, with F.D. Roosevelt coining the term United Nations. And finally, the Soviet Union under Stalin came together with three big powers coming together under the Tehran Conference declaration of the three powers. They were considered as the big three. So, US, Soviet Union, and Britain came together, and by 1945, they decided to bring the global community as part of a United Nations conference. This conference was held in San Francisco in 1945, hosted by the United States. The United Nations Conference on International Organization. This is where around 50 countries came together, and they basically carved out the UN principles that would become part of the UN Charter. And by mid 1945, the UN Charter was brought out and signed with 51 founding members, original founding members. Almost 50 countries were part of the negotiations. Poland also joined in later. And these 51 nations, that included India as well, became the founding members of the UN. Now, you might ask, how could India participate when India was not even independent? Yes, even though India was under colonial rule, India had representatives at these negotiations starting as early as 1942. In fact, at the San Francisco conference, there was an Indian delegation as India was preparing for eventual independence and decolonization. So India became a founding member. So by October 1945, India completed the ratification process and formally joined the UN as a full time member state. So this is the evolution and the founding of the United Nations. Now, what are the objectives of the UN? The objectives are outlined under the UN Charter. As I said, it is the constitution of the UN. It lays down the objectives, the principles, and as well as the internal functioning of the various organs of the UN. There are five major objectives that are laid down under the UN Charter. The first and foremost objective is to maintain international peace and security, essentially to prevent another global conflict, to ensure that another world war doesn't occur, and to resolve standing disputes peacefully through talks, through mediation, by pushing the hostile parties towards negotiations, by bringing them to the negotiating table, in order to ensure that bilateral disputes are not allowed to turn into bigger conflicts. Parallelly, the second objective which was added to the UN Charter was to promote human rights. Because during both world wars, there were large scale human rights violations, with genocides being committed, war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed. Europe and Africa, Asia, across the world, you could see the devastating impact left behind by World War I and then World War II. The Holocaust, where Nazi Germany committed brutal killings of the Jews, or what Imperial Fascist Japan did in China and Southeast Asia, or what Italy did across the Mediterranean and Africa and West Asia region. The kind of atrocities they committed. Even the Allied powers were no less, using brutal force, disproportionate force against civilians, triggering massive refugee crisis, resulting in a humanitarian catastrophe and the eventual nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the US that brought the war to an end. It had brought up the question of human rights and the need to protect human rights. So the UN was mandated with this task to protect, promote, uphold human rights and give a shape to global human rights conventions. It paved the way for the Geneva Conventions, the Genocide Convention, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, which became the basic framework on which today's human rights international framework is built upon. The next objective was to foster economic and social development. As I said, until then, nation states were obsessed with the militarized state model of a police state, focusing just on militarization, security, intelligence, with governance and welfare being the last priority. So finally, the world started taking a different look towards administration and governance. With the rise of the welfare model, socio-economic development became critical because the world wars had destroyed the economy of almost all nations. Infrastructure had been decimated, cities had been brought down to rumbles, uh, key industries, infrastructure had been completely wiped out. So there was a need to rebuild, to address basic challenges from education and poverty to healthcare and uplift people through better opportunities. So socio-economic development and welfare became a top focus of the UN. Next, protecting the environment. See, the Industrial Revolution and the two world wars had contributed to large scale pollution and destruction of the environment and biodiversity. The emissions, the problems of air and water pollution. And finally, it started getting some attention at the global level because these were transboundary problems. It's not just one country which would be affected, right? Entire regions, entire ecosystems could be affected. So finally, environment conservation, biodiversity protection was added as a priority. Then finally, the fifth objective, providing aid and assistance on humanitarian grounds to those who are dealing with famines, those who are dealing with a refugee crisis, those who are victims of an armed conflict, coming to their assistance because the world was dealing with a massive refugee problem. The world was increasingly getting impacted by disasters, even natural disasters, and the victims of war and conflict. So there was a need to rehabilitate those victims. There was a need to provide basic aid and assistance like food, medicine, first aid, shelter, clothing, and providing that humanitarian assistance and support became one of the priorities of the United Nations under the objectives of the UN. So these are the five primary objectives. Now, when you look at the United Nations, it is structured into six primary organs. The structure of the UN is also very, very important for the exams. See, tomorrow we will talk about other international organizations, including the Bretton Woods institutions, such as World Bank and IMF, and as well as other UN related institutions like WHO or International Maritime Organization, or let's say UNICEF, UNEP, UNDP, and all the others. These are the various funds, programs, and specialized agencies of the UN. But today, we will restrict our discussion to the primary organs of the UN, which are part of the UN organization itself. So the six primary organs include UN General Assembly, UN Security Council and the UN Secretariat. Then we have the ECOSOC or the UN Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice or the ICJ, and the Trusteeship Council. These six organs are the primary organs which are part of the main UN organization, right? All the others are either programs, funds, or specialized agencies of the UN, which we will cover in tomorrow's class. Now, before we talk about these primary organs, understand their role, their structure, and composition, and why there is a call for reforming these institutions, I have one more important announcement. Many students have been writing to us, pointing out one major problem in their preparation, which is the lack of mains answer writing practice. So, to help those students, we are launching a new program, the Advanced Mains Program, which entirely focuses on building your mains answer writing skills. This course starts from 2nd September, will continue till 10th of January with 240 plus hours of classes. We will focus on PYQ based discussion, theme based topics that we'll pick up for answer writing practice. We will cover essential concepts and current affairs and try to predict probable topics with questions for each topic and answer writing practice. We will also conduct weekly tests with evaluation and a detailed feedback. You will also get full length tests at the end of the course, along with handouts and detailed notes for each class. So, this course is priced at 9,999, and you can even take a look at the schedule breakup for different subjects. So those of you who are interested, please head to the description box and you can find the link to enroll for the advanced mains program. Now, coming back to our discussion, let's take up these UN organs one by one and understand the structure and composition and the main flaws that exist with these institutions. When you look at UN General Assembly, this is considered as the most universal body within the UN because it has universal membership. All 193 member states are part of the General Assembly. And the best part with UNGA is that each member has one single vote. They have an equal vote, irrespective of the size of the country, irrespective of its global influence, irrespective of its economic and military might. Every nation which is a member of the UN has one equal vote at the UN General Assembly. So that's why it's considered as the most democratic institution within the UN. So be it US or Maldives, be it Russia or let's say Angola, be it India or let's say a small nation in the South Pacific like the Solomon Islands. Every country in the world has equal rights, equal vote at UN General Assembly. This body functions as the main policy making institution, deliberative body, and it provides equitable representation for the global community, irrespective of the population of a nation or the size of a country, right? There is no discrimination as such, and every member state gets a seat, and they all get one equal vote. Ideally, this should have been the most powerful organ of the UN. Probably that's when UN would have functioned more efficiently. But however, that is not the case. UNGA does not exercise key decision making powers, and that is one of the biggest limitations. Now, why wasn't a democratic universal body not given the decision making powers, especially on key subjects like maintaining peace and security, imposing economic sanctions, or authorizing the use of force? These key powers were not vested with the UN General Assembly. The reason is when League of Nations existed, the basic problem was decision making was done through consensus, where consensus of all the members was necessary. And League of Nations lacked its own enforcement powers. That's also one reason why it failed as an organization. Countries could not come to a common ground. They couldn't come to an agreement. It only led to more bickering and disputes and fights, and it became an ineffective organization. Because of that experience, UNGA was not given the key decision making powers. Those powers are vested in the hands of an elite club within the UN Security Council, which we will discuss next. So, UNGA still acts as a key deliberative body where all global issues can be discussed. It holds an annual summit in September every year, where countries, leaders from across the world assemble, where it is headquartered in New York, to bring up global issues or challenges affecting each country. And they essentially try to cast a spotlight on the key challenges that are affecting their nations. For example, India uses the annual UNGA summit to expose Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism, or we highlight issues of the global south. So UNGA remains a key platform, a deliberative body. It also plays a role in policy making, decision making, but key powers are not vested with it. Now, this organ is chaired by the UNGA presidency. The proceedings are headed by the presidency, which rotates every year amongst countries from 5 geographical regions. A geographical quota is provided where the seat of the UNGA presidency rotates from one country to another amongst these regions. For example, let's say this year the presidency lies with an African country. Next, it would go to a East European country. Next, it would go to a Latin American country. Next, it would go to a West European country. So, a system of rotation is created for equitable geographical representation. And it controls the UN budget. It can assess UN policies, pressing global issues, and it also exercises key appointment powers to important institutions. For example, it is the appointing authority for the UN Secretary General, who heads the UN Secretariat. It plays a role in electing members to key UN bodies, including specialized agencies and programs and funds of the UN. It also plays a role in appointing, electing judges to the International Court of Justice. So these are some key powers vested with UN General Assembly. But however, the most important powers, they are not with UNGA. The most critical powers of the UN are provided in the hands of the UN Security Council within an elite club known as the P5, or the five permanent members of the UN Security Council. The five permanent members, as you know, includes US, UK, France, Russia, and China. These five countries hold a permanent seat, and there are 10 non permanent members who are elected based on a geographical quota, based on a rotating term, and they get a 2-year term each. For example, India has been elected to the non permanent seat 8 times. The most recent term held by India as a non permanent member of UNSC was in 2021 2022. Recently, India has launched a fresh campaign to contest the ninth term for the upcoming elections for the 2028 period. So these countries are elected for 2-year terms, 10 non permanent members based on a geographical quota. 5 seats from African Asian countries, 1 seat for Eastern Europe, 2 from Latin America, 2 from Western Europe. Now, why were these countries given the permanent seat? It's not just the permanent seat, they also enjoy the decisive veto power, the most powerful weapon within the UN Security Council. See, first of all, you need to know what is the role of the UN Security Council. The objective of maintaining peace and security, dealing with wars, conflicts, and security threats lies with the UNSC, which is the most important critical objective. So let's say a border dispute is turning into a war between two nations and UN has to intervene, mediate. It is the UNSC which takes a call. It is UNSC which exercises control over UN peacekeeping forces, over the deployment of UN peacekeeping missions. UNSC gets to impose economic sanctions when countries are violating international law, acting like a rogue state. If a particular country has to be targeted with UN sanctions, the approval has to come from the P5 countries, the veto holding countries of the UNSC. If, let's say, a country has to be punished through military action, if a country has to be invaded with an international coalition force, then the authority to use military action or military force lies with the UNSC. The authorization to use force in order to maintain peace and stability, to protect international order, lies with UNSC. In fact, there's a very controversial principle and concept called R2P, responsibility to protect. Western countries have championed this ideology. They often state that they have a responsibility to protect human rights and democracy. And in the name of democracy and human rights, they've often obtained UN sanction to invade other countries. So this has been a very controversial principle where often this power has been used for geopolitical interests to carry out regime change, right? So these critical powers of controlling peacekeeping forces, deploying peacekeeping missions, mediating between countries which have a conflict, working out solutions between their issues, or authorizing the use of force, imposing economic sanctions, and even other important security related issues such as counterterrorism, global nuclear disarmament, preventing a global nuclear arms race. All these key responsibilities lies with UN Security Council. So these P5 countries retain that ultimate power. They often use the veto not in the interests of global peace and stability, but to fulfill their own narrow geopolitical interests. The UNSC has a big division, an ideological division, which goes back to the Cold War period. The US is aligned with UK and France on one side, with Western democracies within the P5, Russia and China, previously Soviet Union and China, aligning on one side. Just look at how the veto has been cast. Soviet Union Russia has used the veto at least 135 times, which means it has always blocked any Western agenda. Look at the number of times US has used it, almost 84 times, again to block Soviet and communist expansion and communist agenda. So they have played their own political game within the UNSC, selectively using the powers of the UN to target nations aligned with the other bloc. And that has been the fundamental problem with the UN Security Council. This seat held by China was previously with Republic of China, which we have studied in our previous sessions. It was only later that the seat was transferred to the PRC, the People's Republic of China. Right? That is something you need to be aware of. So you can see that within the UNSC, there is an unequal distribution of power. The 10 non-permanent members almost have a nominal role to play. The only advantage is that being a non-permanent member gives you a chance to hold the presidency for at least 1 month or 2 months during your 2-year term, where you can set the agenda and achieve coordination amongst the 15 members of the UNSC. Beyond that, non-permanent members have a very limited role to play, with all the key powers vested with the veto-wielding P5 countries, which makes them the most powerful because they can use and twist the system to their advantage. And that is where the main concern lies with the UN. Next, we have the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. This is the primary welfare organ of the UN, like a think tank, driving development initiatives, welfare programs. So when you look at UN initiating the Millennium Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goals, or efforts to combat climate change, focus on disaster risk reduction, efforts to tackle poverty, improve urban governance, or to make our cities disaster resilient, or to combat maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rate, improve literacy, employment, skilling. All these welfare oriented initiatives primarily stem from the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council. These welfare developmental programs are conceptualized by the ECOSOC and implemented through the efforts of the ECOSOC. It gives a push, it drives these initiatives by coordinating with national governments, by helping them, assisting them in implementing these initiatives to achieve the laid down targets within the given deadline. So the ECOSOC consists of 54 member nations who are elected from within the UN member states. Out of the 193 countries, 54 get to be a part of the Economic and Social Council. 18 countries are elected every year from the UNGA for a 3-year term, and every member country has one equal vote. Currently, India is an elected member to the ECOSOC, holding the term for 2026 to 2028, which means India gets to shape global welfare efforts through the Economic and Social Council. Please understand that membership in most of the UN organs is based on a geographical quota system to ensure that there is a fair and equitable distribution of seats across regions. But if you noticed, within UN Security Council, there is zero representation for the entire continent of Africa, for Latin America region. If you look at just the P5 countries, US is from North America, right? Then three of them are from Europe and Eurasia region, UK, France, and Russia. China from Asia. Asia has, let's say, one, if you consider Russia as well, maybe two representatives. But the whole continent of Africa, Latin America region has zero representation within the permanent category of UNSC members. That highlights the structural flaws that are present within the UN and its institutions. So all the specialized agencies, programs, funds of the UN, like UN Environment Program, UN Development Program, UNICEF, UNESCO, they all function under the ECOSOC or Economic and Social Council. Then comes Trusteeship Council, which today has become defunct. The Trusteeship Council was set up to administer the trusteeship territories that existed after World War II, to administer these areas, to push them towards self governance and eventual independence. So, once all these territories transitioned towards independence or merged with other nations, the job of the council was done. By 1994, the last trusteeship territory, Palau in South Pacific, became an independent sovereign nation. With that, the task of this council was completed. So it has no other role, no other function. And since then, its operations have been suspended. It only exists on paper. Theoretically, it remains a primary organ. But however, the functioning has come to a halt. It is a defunct organization which just remains on paper as a primary organ of the UN. Now, which were these trusteeship territories? This can be a possible prelims question as well. Territories like Samoa in the South Pacific, Tanganyika, which today has merged with Tanzania, which is now part of Tanzania in Africa, in East Africa. Then few other African territories like Cameroon, Rwanda, then few other territories in the South Pacific like Nauru and Palau. or the Italian Somaliland in Horn of Africa region. Right? These were the 11 trusteeship territories that existed. They were essentially the territories that were colonized by the Axis powers. They were divided between the Allied powers later on. It was brought under the administration of UK, France, US, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Right? Even Italy was brought in later to administer some of these territories following the transition of Italy post World War II. And they essentially governed these trusteeship territories for a while, preparing those territories for eventual independence or for merger with other sovereign states. So once this task was completed by 1994, with Palau becoming an independent nation in the South Pacific, the task of this council was completed. So since then, it is a defunct organization, but on paper remains as a primary organ of the UN. Then coming to the judicial arm of the UN, the ICJ, International Court of Justice. So ICJ essentially settles disputes between the member states of the UN. It is meant to adjudicate disputes between two or more states. Like let's say India, Pakistan have a dispute, or let's say Russia, China have a dispute, or US and Canada have a dispute. So to settle the matter and apply international law to these international disputes, member states can approach the ICJ for adjudication. So it's a legal process that it follows as per the UN Charter and other aspects of international law and customary international law. Apart from these binding judgments it delivers, these rulings of ICJ are binding. Countries have to mandatorily follow them as they are committed to the principles of UN Charter. Take, for example, the Kulbhushan Jadhav case, where Pakistan has held an Indian national, a former Navy commander, accusing him of being an Indian spy and delivered the death punishment. India immediately approached ICJ seeking a stay order and consular access. And following this, Pakistan has been obliged to stay the execution of Kulbhushan Jadhav, and it had to provide consular access to India. So, for such matters, it could be a transboundary river dispute, boundary issues, or enforcement of a particular treaty, right? All these matters between states can be brought up at ICJ, and the orders are binding. Countries have to mandatorily follow these orders. If they violate, action can be taken against them through sanctions, right? Through global diplomatic isolation brought in through the UN. And even UN institutions can approach ICJ mainly for legal advice. Let's say World Bank has a legal issue to be addressed, or UNICEF needs a legal opinion. So they can seek advisory opinion. UN bodies, international organizations, specialized agencies of UN, they can also approach ICJ for seeking legal advice and legal opinion. These are the only two subject matters handled by ICJ. So private individuals cannot go to ICJ. Companies and non-state actors cannot go to ICJ. Is that clear? For example, a terror group or an NGO or a private multinational corporation, they can't approach ICJ asking for justice. This is meant only for two jurisdictions. One, state to state dispute, and two, legal opinion, advisory opinion given to international organizations. Those are the only two types of cases that are taken up by ICJ. It comprises of 15 judges elected for a 9-year term through elections conducted in the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council. Elections happen both in General Assembly and Security Council, and finally, these judges are chosen. 1/3 are elected every 3 years, and they're also eligible for re-election. So please remember the overall structure and composition. Currently, we have an Indian judge, a former Supreme Court judge, Justice Dalveer Bhandari, who was elected to the ICJ. It took incredible diplomatic efforts from India to ensure Dalveer Bhandari was elected. India was against a British judge who was contesting, where UK was backing the British judge, while India was backing the former Supreme Court justice. In this diplomatic battle, India got the support at UNGA again and again, but UK, being a permanent member, got the support at the UN Security Council. Finally, after multiple rounds of tie, India UK reached a settlement. UK withdrew its candidate and it allowed the Indian judge to be elected. So Dalveer Bhandari's term has even been extended and continues to serve as an international judge. But please understand, though governments back their candidates, these judges will not act as government representatives. They can't act in favor of their nation. They are supposed to be impartial. They are no more loyal to their government or their country alone. They are international judges responsible for applying international law in an unbiased manner. So that is one important point you need to keep in mind. Then coming to the Secretariat. The UN Secretariat is the executive arm of the UN. It essentially aids the functioning of Security Council and General Assembly. It implements the decisions taken by the Security Council and the General Assembly. It coordinates with Economic Social Council and drives the welfare programs with other UN institutions and the respective national governments. So this is the executive branch of the UN headed by the UN Secretary General, who is essentially chosen by the Security Council but appointed by the UN General Assembly. So the Secretary General is the highest ranking civil servant under the UN Civil Services. And by the way, civil services aspirants in India, many of them are not aware that you can actually take up UN Civil Services as a plan B, right? There are many UN institutions which conduct few courses which will make you eligible for internships. They even hold competitive exams. And there are multiple paths through which you can enter UN civil services, either through the courses run by the UN institutions, through the internship route where most of them get permanently recruited into the civil service, or they even have a competitive process. So that is something you need to explore and find out. If you want, please let me know in the comments. I can make a separate video just on UN as a career option, as a plan B option, because it provides incredible exposure, right? There are plenty of opportunities in, let's say, WHO, UNICEF, UNESCO, and other organs and branches of the UN. So we can make a detailed video on this if you're interested, but please let me know in the comments. Now, the Secretary General is elected for a 5-year term, essentially chosen by the Security Council, but appointed by the General Assembly. Currently, it is Antonio Guterres, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, whose term has been extended for a second 5-year term. Now, Antonio Guterres is supposed to end his term this year. So by January 2027, a new Secretary General will be chosen. And the process is currently ongoing. Since Antonio Guterres has just a few months left, to ensure that a new Secretary General takes over by 1st January 2027, UN General Assembly is working with Security Council to select and appoint the next Secretary General. Now, this process is largely dominated by the P5, especially by US and Western powers. In most cases, the UN Secretary General has been a candidate backed by the United States. See, as a matter of convention, nationals and citizens of P5 countries are not pushed, meaning American citizen or Russian citizen, Chinese citizens are not pushed. They often back candidates from other countries, from Myanmar or from Portugal or from South Africa or from Brazil. So there is a lot of politics which goes on behind this, right? There is a lot of political equations which are taken into account, but generally it is United States which manages to get the most influence, most support, and pushes its candidate from a third country to be appointed as the Secretary General. Here as well, you see the domination of the West, domination of the United States, right? From India, Dr. Shashi Tharoor had contested, tried this process, but eventually was moved out because of the lack of support from the Western countries. So this again highlights the internal problems that exist within the UN. Now coming to India's equation with the United Nations. See, India as a responsible international player has remained strictly committed to its promises and commitments under the UN Charter and the principles of the international legal framework. India is a law-abiding nation. We uphold the rules-based order. We simply don't preach. We follow them first and we expect others to follow these rules. So as a responsible, law-abiding nation, India has committed to uphold the UN Charter and the principles. That's why we treat these commitments with such seriousness. And from the beginning, from 1945, 1947, India has been making a big positive contribution to the multilateral world order by championing the voice of the weaker countries. India itself had suffered from the horrors of colonialism. So after independence, India took a firm stand, an ideological approach against colonialism, imperialism. We even supported the independence movement and freedom struggle of multiple nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. India took a stand against the notorious apartheid in South Africa, where the black community was openly discriminated, racially segregated by the white South Afrikaners. Right? India aided and supported the anti-apartheid movement under Nelson Mandela, with India even giving diplomatic and covert intelligence support, be it for freedom movements in Africa, anti-apartheid struggle. India was at the forefront of raising its voice and standing for the weak nations and the developing, underdeveloped world. Today, India is seen as a leader of the global south. India championed the non aligned movement as a third neutral ideology when the world was divided between the American and the Soviet power blocs. We brought some sense of stability by creating a third world order. India leads a group called G77, which today consists of 120 plus countries. They are all from the global south, consisting of developing, underdeveloped nations. And India helps the global south to take a stand against the global north whenever there is a issue which comes up because of the developmental divide, be it climate change negotiations, world trade negotiations under WTO, right? Negotiations involving intellectual property, subsidies, or let's say frameworks related to cybercrime, frameworks related to international maritime laws, right? India always takes a firm stand, acting for the global south nations, also bringing up their developmental challenges from health to education. And that's why India has now emerged as a champion of the developing, underdeveloped world. India also upholds human rights, protects human rights, calls out human right violations. And India even pushes the world towards a stable world order. We urge countries to stop wars and conflicts. You take Russia, you take Israel, you take Iran, US. India has been urging these nations to stop the conflict, talk to each other, negotiate. And that is what UN principles provide for under the UN Charter. And when it comes to UN peacekeeping, India is one of the biggest contributors. Till date, India has contributed more than 2 lakh personnel to UN peacekeeping missions, starting right from the Korean War to ongoing conflicts in Lebanon, in Democratic Republic of Congo. Right? India has been at the forefront of contributing troops from Indian Army and the other armed forces, from our paramilitary forces like BSF, ITBP, even from our police forces. They are sent on deputation for these UN peacekeeping missions under the blue helmets, as they are referred to as. UN peacekeepers are also known as the blue helmets. So India is one of the leading contributor of troops. Till date, we have contributed a total of more than 2 lakh personnel with entire women contingents that were deployed in Liberia and other African conflict zones. So naturally, India has paid the biggest price. We have lost more than 180 personnel, which accounts for the highest casualty suffered by any country in UN peacekeeping roles. More than 180 Indian soldiers have been martyred in global conflict zones as part of these peacekeeping missions. But the worst part is that though India is the biggest contributor, India doesn't have a say. We don't have a voice when it comes to the safety of the troops and the peacekeepers, when it comes to their deployment and their overall well being, or holding the killers of the troops accountable under international law. We have no say or no voice in that. This power is controlled by the P5 because the UNSC decides upon the deployment and the safety of the peacekeepers, and that power is basically concentrated with the P5. And the worst part, P5 countries are not the big troop contributing countries, right? While they get involved in military invasions and military campaigns that serve their own geopolitical agendas, they never contribute large troops for peacekeeping missions. It is always poor countries, developing, underdeveloped nations, which are contributing troops for peacekeeping missions. Countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Kenya, Philippines. These are the countries which are the biggest troop contributors, right? Because they're trying to shape a global image for themselves by contributing to global peacekeeping efforts. But the worst part, they have no role, no voice in this. That's why India is pushing for an initiative called Group of Friends that was established with the help of France and other troop contributing nations, which are now pushing for controlling rights when it comes to deploying the peacekeepers. Because if these are our soldiers, the countries should also have a say along with the P5 nations to decide how the troops will be deployed and to ensure their safety and well-being. So this is a recently created platform led by India, France, and few other troop contributing countries. It's called the Group of Friends Initiative. Apart from this, India has had a very big positive impact on the UN and its initiatives. We have committed to implement Millennium Development Goals, and now we are striving towards Agenda 2030, the Sustainable Development Goal targets. India is well on its way to improve some of the key indicators from hunger and poverty and malnutrition to tackling maternal mortality, infant mortality, improving our urban infrastructure, improving our disaster governance. India is strictly committed to the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which has already been integrated into our national disaster management policy and plan. We are committed to the climate change efforts. India is in strict compliance with the voluntary goals announced under the Paris Agreement. And India has already achieved some of the voluntary targets, and we are well on the way to achieve the remaining targets. India was the one which championed the CBDR principle with other global south countries, including China. CBDR stands for Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. While fighting climate change is a common responsibility of every country, the responsibility should be shared. It should be divided as per individual emission contribution. That's where the concept of historical emissions, historical responsibilities comes into picture. And developed industrialized countries are expected to share a higher burden, with the equitable share being provided for developing nations, creating enough space for utilizing their carbon budget. So India championed this principle right from 1990s under the UN climate change framework. When it comes to counter-terrorism, India has been at the forefront. We have been pushing for a global convention called CCIT, which was proposed by India in 1996 for a global convention under the UN against terrorism. The Convention on International Terrorism. It's a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. It stands for CCIT, proposed by India. It mainly targets state-sponsored terrorism, and it calls upon countries to act against those nations which are sponsoring terrorism, creating a safe haven for terrorist groups like Pakistan. But due to lack of global support, the CCIT convention has not been adopted. Many countries are against it because they all use terrorism as a weapon for their geopolitical agendas. Then India uses platforms like 1267 Sanctions Committee under the UN Security Council to designate global terrorists. This committee is also known as the Taliban Sanctions Committee or the Al Qaeda Sanctions Committee. Now it's also known as the ISIL or Daesh Sanctions Committee, referring to the Islamic State. So global terrorists can be sanctioned through this committee, and the decisions are taken by the UNSC members, by the 15 countries through consensus. All 15 UNSC members have to agree. They have to come to a consensus when it comes to designating global terrorists. India has been using this platform to target Pakistan-based terrorists, from Hafiz Saeed to Zakir Rahman Lakwi to Masood Azhar. All these terrorists have been designated. But China keeps creating a block. It tries protecting Pakistan by blocking India's efforts each and every time by citing a lack of evidence. As I said, the sanctioning cannot go through without the consensus of all the UNSC members. So China, being a member of UNSC, gets to block the proposal, and it has always created this hurdle. India had to try for almost a decade to designate Masood Azhar as a global terrorist, the founder of Jaish-e-Mohammed, right? So this has been a key initiative where India is driving counter-terror efforts through the United Nations. With regard to nuclear disarmament, India has always called for equitable and fair global disarmament under the Rajiv Gandhi Action Plan, proposed by then Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1988. Or how India set up the UN Democracy Fund in 2005 under the Manmohan Singh government to strengthen and support nascent democracies across the world. Or look at how India helped the global south during the pandemic under Vaccine Maitri initiative. Look at the humanitarian assistance, disaster relief that India provides to other nations. All these are examples of India's leadership role, and yet India's demand for reforms of the UN is not being met. This is where you can expect another probable question. Why UN is outdated? Why reforms are necessary? What is holding back UN reforms? What is India's stand and position on the topic of UN reforms? That is one last topic we have to discuss. Now, when you look at United Nations as a whole, you realize that its structure and composition is completely outdated. It was an institution that was framed and established in 1945 and reflects the realities of 1945. It does not take into account the current geopolitical realities of the world. See, back then, only the P5 countries were seen as large, capable countries with enough military and economic influence to positively contribute to the United Nations. But today, that is no longer the case. There are several middle powers like India, Japan, Germany, Brazil. Then how come you don't have a single African country, a single Latin American country? Entire continents have been excluded. So there are several middle powers which are equally capable, responsible, and eligible to play this leadership role to make this institution more effective. But for that, reforms are required, right? So India is pushing for a permanent seat with other like-minded nations since 1990s. It's more than a 3-decade initiative. It's been more than 30 years since the discussion of UN reforms began, especially after the end of Cold War. With the collapse of Soviet Union, the world order had changed. We entered a unipolar world with US as the sole superpower. So since then, countries have been campaigning to reform the UN to reflect current geopolitical realities by pointing out that UN is outdated and stuck in the realities of 1945. So how can such an organization framed in 1945 be relevant in today's world? That is the fundamental problem, the structural problem with the UN. So India has formed an alliance with Brazil, Japan, and Germany, creating an informal club called the G4 to push for UN reforms, especially UNSC reforms, demanding a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. But these reforms are countered by their regional rivals. Like, for example, Pakistan opposes a permanent seat to India because obviously Pakistan is worried that if India were to get the seat, balance of power would swing in favor of India. Then each of these countries of G4, they have their regional rivals. For Brazil, Argentina and other South American countries are rivals. For Japan, South Korea would become a rival. For Germany, Italy is seen as a rival, right? Even China in general is opposed to any reforms. It doesn't want India, Japan to enter the UNSC as permanent members. So some of these nations, they have formed a counter group called the Coffee Club to oppose the push given by the G4 countries. So India's demand is very simple, that the institution is today outdated. Its structure is stuck in 1945. It has to reflect the current realities. And for that, UNSC has to change. The permanent category has to expand. More countries should be given permanent seats. One proposal is to consider the G4. There is a proposal to consider all G20 countries, right? So either ways, there has to be an expansion. And it's also about the question of the veto power. How come the P5 countries alone get to cast veto? Or the debate also focuses on removing the veto power altogether and taking decisions on the basis of majority or through consensus. Because see, the P5 is right now divided on geopolitical grounds. As I said, Russia, China on one side, US, UK, France on the other side. That's the prime reason why UN is almost useless and ineffective. And there is a clear global north versus global south divide with hardly any representation for global south. Why can't the UN reflect a greater cultural diversity, greater economic diversity, and political diversity? Why not have one island nation? Why not have one African country, one Latin American country as a permanent member? This is a very fair and legitimate demand. So that's why the reform agenda today has acquired a much wider proportion and meaning. It's not just about getting a permanent seat. It's not just limited to that. Many people have this misconception that UN reforms is just about becoming a permanent member in the Security Council. Of course, that is the primary agenda, but that is not the only reform agenda. There are other issues to be addressed. What about the veto held by the P5? What if they agree for new permanent members, but they refuse to give them veto. They'll say we'll accept India and few others, but will not give them veto power. Veto power will remain with P5. Is that acceptable to us? So that is where the debate is centered. It's about better representation in terms of geography, in terms of culture, in terms of population, in terms of race. UN should essentially reflect the global diversity which is present. What about the actual working methods, the relations between UNGA and UNSC, the election process, the appointment process, the supremacy UN Security Council has over the General Assembly is also a matter of concern. So all these issues are part of the reforms agenda which are being debated and discussed for many, many years. Several countries within the P5 have come to support the reform process. At least verbally, they have given support. For example, when it comes to inclusion of new members, especially India and few others, some of the permanent members have given verbal support. Like US, Russia, UK, and France, they have publicly stated that they support India as a permanent member of UNSC. They are willing to welcome India and support the reform process. But verbal support will not do anything. That's pretty much useless. It's like your manager promising you a hike over a phone call. Unless and until you actually get an appraisal letter from the HR, it has no purpose, no value, right? For that, you need text based guarantees, text based negotiations to begin. And this has never started. See, China is in general blocking all UN reforms. Others are blaming China, but that's not the entire truth. Even US, Russia, UK, France, they also don't want to give up this elite power that they hold through the veto. Though they give verbal promises to countries like India just to appease them, in reality, none of them are genuinely interested in reforming the UN. Now, you might argue, why are we waiting for the P5 countries to approve the reforms? That's because of the structure and the provisions of the UN Charter. If UNSC has to be altered, if new permanent members have to be added, if the veto power has to be altered, the approval has to come from the P5. Apart from a special majority in UN General Assembly, you need a two-third majority, which is manageable. You can try to achieve this. If G4 countries work together, they can bring enough influence from global south and we can secure a two-third majority in the General Assembly. But that is not enough. You need approval from Security Council, which is from the P5. So even if one P5 country casts a veto, the proposal will fall apart. Which means the P5 countries have to come to a consensus to reform the UN. And that is the conflict of interest which is present. None of the P5 countries want to genuinely give up their power and share it with others. They know that it serves a geopolitical purpose. See, generally it is said that to be considered as eligible for a permanent seat, there are certain criteria. It's not laid down under law, not through UN Charter, but there are certain expectations for a country to be considered as a permanent member. Even if you have to, push your candidature, there are certain criteria that you require. For example, the country, of course, has to be a major economic and military power, which means you should have the ability to influence. Or else small, weak powers, if you give them a permanent seat, that's pretty much useless. They can't shape the world, right? You need big, major powers. You need top economies, top military powers, which have the ability to act, draw some influence, and shape global narrative. Then they should be a major contributor to the UN budget. UN functions on contributions from the member states. Only the big contributors can be given that role and position to play a much bigger role. They should also account for a big population, right? These are some basic criteria that are expected. It's not laid down under UN Charter, but this is what is expected. A country should be respecting democracy and human rights. I know you might argue Russia, China, they don't. They are not democracies and human rights is often crushed. But as I said, there is a hypocrisy built into this system, right? So at least these are some basic expectations. When you look at the contributions, this is the table with regard to the contributions countries are making in terms of financial contribution to the UN. India is at rank 21 with a 0.8 percentage share contribution to the UN budget. US and China are the top two contributors with 22 and 12%. Kindly remember the top five contributors and as well as India's position. Now, unless and until India rises up the rank, you can't, raise a stronger voice for a permanent seat. India is already a major economic power. We have a large population. We have a large military as well, right? We are a democracy respecting human rights. We fulfill all those criterias. One aspect where India is still behind is with regard to its contribution to the UN. It has increased, of course, over the last 6 years. This was back in 2019. Today, it has jumped in the range of 1.5 to 2%. But there is still a long way for India to go to be able to, convince the global community for reforming the UN. And as I said, it's not just about India's influence and push. It also matters as to what other countries are doing. But as of now, the process is stalled. The P5 countries, they want status quo to be maintained. And given the current circumstances, I don't think UN reforms will ever take place in the next 5 to 10 years. It almost looks impossible. But still, the institution remains relevant. It still remains valuable for contemporary geopolitics. So, this is what we had to learn in today's session. I hope it's been an eye opener, insightful session on the United Nations and the relevance of international organizations. So, tomorrow we will continue the discussion. We'll talk about other international organizations. We'll look at few specialized agencies of the UN. We'll look at few funds and programs of the UN. We'll look at the Bretton Woods institutions, all these multilateral platforms that play a critical role in global geopolitics. We'll try to cover that in tomorrow's class. So I hope you guys enjoyed the session. If you did, please hit the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to share the video with other aspirants. On this note, I bring the session to an end. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.